under the pounding echo of mortars and the long hiss of sniper rounds cutting through the brittle, dusty wind. Sergeant Eli Mason found himself utterly alone on a battlefield that had moments earlier throbbed with life. His unit had been scattered after a brutal ambush along the edge of the war-torn village of Drajik, a remote cluster of stone and clay homes surrounded by dry hills and crumbling olive trees in a fictional border conflict that had dragged on too long. 58 years old, once a combat engineer in the Gulf War and now a logistical advisor recalled to field duty due to his uncanny knowledge of old Soviet-era tactics, Eli had been tolerated more than respected by younger officers who saw him as a relic in desert camo. As the chaos subsided into smoke and silence, Eli crawled through a shallow ditch littered with the cracked remnants of broken equipment, his breath wheezing under the pressure of his gear and the acrid stink of burnt cordite. The sun hung like a dead bulb in the hazy sky, casting long, bleeding shadows across the wreckage, and the ground trembled with distant artillery. Not far off, voices barked orders in a guttural dialect, enemy boots scraping gravel as they fanned out to sweep for survivors. With nowhere else to turn and a thigh wound weeping sluggish blood, Eli dragged himself toward a lone, partially intact house near the village's edge, its roof buckled inward, one shutter banging lazily in the dry wind. He pushed through a cracked wooden door, the interior heavy with dust and the ghost smell of stale bread, and found nothing but abandoned belongings, a child's tattered shoe, a rusted kettle, and a portrait frame turned to face the wall. Upstairs would be suicide, the cellar likely a trap or collapsed, so Eli slipped behind a warped cabinet and slid through a fissure in the floor where a root cellar had once been, landing silently among rotted potatoes and brittle tools. Above, the voices grew louder, footsteps on stone growing deliberate, cautious. From his hiding place, wedged in darkness with a stench of mildew clawing at his throat, Eli heard them enter, 3 or maybe 4, their rifles clacking softly as they swept room by room. His pulse beat in his ears like a drumline, and every breath was a prayer. The crawlspace was small, tight, the earth pressing on his shoulders like judgment, but it offered what the rest of the village couldn't, time. And silence. He pressed his back flat against the dirt, barely moving, mind racing not just to stay alive but to think, to plan. His old instincts, dulled but not dead, told him they were searching for maps, intel, or any clue left behind by the retreating U.S. forces. What they didn't know, and what Eli had glimpsed in the last frantic minutes of the ambush, was that a field commander among them had been transmitting from a compromised position, one Eli had marked before everything went to hell. He remembered the pattern of the flag, the identifiers on the vehicle, the orientation of the satellite dish, things no drone could have picked out under camouflage netting, but things a seasoned eye, a Gulf vet like Eli, would catch. That intel alone could shift the balance of the next strike. Above him, a boot scuffed directly over his head. Dust filtered down through a crack, and for a moment Eli thought he'd sneeze and give himself away. But discipline, the old kind, the kind that had kept him alive through 2 tours and a civilian life marked by quiet service and sacrifice, kept him still. Someone muttered, impatient. A man spit. Another cursed. Then came silence again, the kind that stretches, the kind that teeters on the edge of disaster. Minutes passed. An hour. Then, without warning, the creak of the door, a barked command, retreating steps. They were leaving. But Eli didn't move. Not yet. He waited, still and breathing shallowly, long after the last footfall faded. When darkness finally cloaked the land and the house stood abandoned again, Eli emerged slowly, painfully, like a ghost from the earth. He moved with care, rifle slung low, body screaming from the wound, but will unbroken. In the moonlight, he traced a path away from the village, avoiding roads, using the stars and his old notebook compass to navigate the ridges where no satellite eye lingered. By dawn, he reached the forward recon line, collapsed into a medic's arms, and gasped out coordinates between parched lips. The officers were stunned, not just that he'd lived, but that he'd returned with tactical intelligence. Eli said little, only what mattered. A young lieutenant, the same who'd earlier called him over the hill, stood silent, eyes wide, as the team scrambled to verify his findings. But Eli wasn't looking for praise. As he was lifted onto the stretcher, he stared back toward the smoky hills, where the enemy still searched for the ghost who'd vanished under their noses. He hadn't just survived, he'd outwitted them. And for once, that was enough. ChatGPT. Eli Mason had been patched up in silence, his leg wound wrapped tight and his fatigues crusted with dried blood and filth. But his mind was too sharp, Too restless to surrender to the cot, they gave him back at the forward recon shelter tucked between the rocks. Every breath he drew came thick with dust and diesel, and even under the meager safety of the sandbag-lined canvas roof, he could hear the distant thud of artillery and the dull chatter of machine gun bursts echoing through the ravine like ghost fire. Command had taken his information. His coordinates, the strange positioning of the enemy command vehicle, the identifiers etched on the side of that trailer-mounted dish he'd spotted with instinct older than most of the men around him, and they'd nodded and muttered and left him to rest. But Eli knew the way modern war worked, the way shiny tech and sterile war rooms made them all think that human eyes weren't needed anymore, that instinct could be replaced with drone feeds and algorithms. He wasn't angry, not anymore, just resolved. He watched from under a thermal tarp as the new platoon deployed, green kids and tired vets both moving in synchronized lines, and he knew the strike they were planning would fail. Not completely, not bloodily, but enough to give the enemy time to vanish. They didn't understand how the terrain curved down near the ravine's bend, or how the hills swallowed satellite signals. Eli did. So while the others planned assaults with maps lit by blue tablet glow, he found himself back at the rear mechanic's tent, scavenging. He looked like a relic again, limping, muttering to himself, sifting through old signal wires, batteries, grease-smeared cables, things no one cared about anymore in the age of digitized war. That's where Corporal Janie Ross found him, a comms operator barely 25 and still smelling like her first tour. Her brow furrowed like her helmet was too tight. "Sir, you're not cleared to be here," she said, but didn't stop him. Eli explained what he saw, how the enemy comms relay wasn't just a mobile post, but likely a decoy hub, masked to lure drone strikes, while the true intel relay ran deeper in the hills, relaying through local terrain shields that modern signals couldn't penetrate. She hesitated, skeptical, but something about the certainty in Eli's voice slowed her protest. "Let me show you," he said, and she followed. That night, under cover of low clouds and the whine of overhead patrols, they slipped away from the main staging camp, Eli limping, Ross hauling a makeshift signal amplifier strapped together with twisted copper and salvaged pieces from an old field radio Eli had rebuilt himself. Every step jarred Eli's leg, but the pain was distant now, swallowed by purpose. They moved through a dried-out wash, the moonlight slicing through broken clouds like silver blades, and they reached the ridgeline by 0300. There, Eli unwrapped the amplifier, using an old field trick he'd learned in Basra, looping signal feedback through a passive shell to reflect scrambled frequency bursts. Ross stared at him like he was building a time machine, but her doubts faded as the device pinged a frequency burst buried under the static, proof the decoy was active. Eli leaned forward, staring across the dark basin where the enemy had buried their equipment under tarps and brush, just like they had 30 years ago in Iraq. Some tactics never changed. But now came the hard part. Eli proposed they lure the enemy forward by faking a transmission using the same bounce-back pattern the enemy had used on their last intercept. Ross balked. Doing that could expose their location. "Then we move right after," Eli said, already disassembling the device to rewire it. "Before they get a lock." She hesitated again, but then something shifted in her, like she'd remembered she wasn't just there to follow orders but to win the war. So they sent the ping, a short burst coded in the same interval as the decoy, and then they ran, slipping down the ravine's far side, hiding beneath a shelf of rock as two enemy scouts crept into view minutes later, rifles scanning, boots crunching frostbitten stone. Eli pressed against the dirt, listening to their clipped voices, and when they passed without noticing him, he allowed himself the faintest smirk. Not from pride, but from certainty. It was working. Back at camp, command remained unconvinced even after Ross vouched for him, so Eli requested something simple. A mapping drone, programmed to fly low altitude, low noise, and heat capture only. He'd guide it himself. When it launched that evening, skimming the ridge under a false cloud line, the thermal feed revealed a cavern in the hill, just beyond the decoy trailer, an unnatural cold signature suggesting equipment, not stone. "That's your real base," Eli said. The analysts murmured, recalibrating. For the first time in days, someone called him "Sir" without irony. But the enemy wasn't idle. The moment they sensed the decoy pinged, they began shifting. Their scouts moved deeper into the terrain, and the strike window began to close. So Eli proposed a second phase. They wouldn't strike the decoy. They'd wait until the enemy packed up and moved, then trap them mid-transit through a narrow pass that he remembered from old maps, one the satellites hadn't flagged because erosion had rendered it seemingly impassable. "It's passable," he said, "if you know where to look." His confidence was born from memory, not from arrogance. He'd laid wire through that pass once as a young private in a forgotten skirmish. He still remembered the way the earth curved there, how sound bounced oddly off the rocks. With permission finally granted, Eli assembled a strike team, not of elite commandos, but of anyone who'd listen. Ross, 2 scouts, and a radio operator named Finch who'd once taught ham radio to Boy Scouts. They set off at dusk, hiking the hard terrain with only the stars and an old compass to guide them, Eli leaning on a carved stick like some desert shepherd. They reached the pass by midnight, cold wind slicing through them like a blade. There, Eli rigged a signal repeater. When the enemy convoy's comms pinged to check the pass, the repeater would return false clearances. He showed Finch how to wire the old relay circuit, his fingers trembling not from fear, but from age and adrenaline. "Never thought I'd be back here," Eli muttered, mostly to himself. "We used to call this the devil's elbow." Ross looked at him, no longer with doubt, but something closer to awe. Then came the waiting. The team huddled in silence, tucked behind boulders and dried-out shrubs, frost collecting on their helmets. Hours passed. Then, the rumble. Engines, low and growling. Flashlights. Voices. The enemy was coming, trusting the false clearance. Eli steadied his breath. When they reached the pass's bottleneck, Finch flicked the transmitter. Buried charges, planted by engineers based on Eli's mapped coordinates, detonated like thunder, disabling the lead and rear vehicles without killing the occupants. Confused, the enemy scattered. Eli rose and over shortwave broadcast a message in clipped Arabic: "Retreat and you live. Stay and you fall." A bluff, but it worked. By morning, the pass was cleared. Intel salvaged from the disabled vehicles revealed exactly what Eli had suspected: relay codes, future strike plans, and personnel lists. Back at base, command debriefed him thoroughly. Ross was promoted. Finch transferred to recon. And Eli? He just limped back to the cot he'd been given days earlier and sat with a mug of black coffee. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of debriefs, data parsing, and shifting strategy maps. But for Eli Mason, the work was only beginning, not ending. He knew better than to mistake one tactical win for a full-scale turnaround in a war this complex. The terrain hadn't changed, the weather hadn't improved, and the enemy, crafty, entrenched, ruthless, was still out there, licking its wounds and preparing the next move. But something had shifted within the ranks. Where before Eli's words were met with half-listens and thin smiles, now heads turned when he spoke, and not because of his stripes or years of service, but because of the result. Still, the respect wasn't what mattered to him, it was the opportunity. They were finally listening, which meant they could finally act with intelligence, not just muscle. Eli spent nights hunched over field maps with Ross and Finch, dissecting enemy behavior patterns and signal disruptions. He showed them how the old smugglers and Soviet-trained militias had once used terrain not only as a shield but as a language. Paths carved not by roads, but by water runoff, echo pockets, and moonlight angles. Using those same principles, he proposed a route the enemy might use next, one that bypassed the recon net entirely. "They'll strike supply lines here," he said, pointing to a blind ridge, "unless we make them believe they've already been compromised." Thus began the decoy operation. Using scraps of uniforms, empty crates, and falsified radio logs, Eli built a ghost convoy, an illusion of a major supply route protected only lightly, staged just well enough to tempt the enemy into moving. Ross ran the transmissions. Finch coordinated with engineers to bury real explosives just beneath the surface where enemy boots would tread. It was risky, dangerously so, but Eli knew it had to feel real. One mistake, one odd noise, one misaligned crate, and the whole thing would collapse. On the day of the trap, Eli insisted on being there, despite the protests of the medics and the commanding officers. "I was here when this started," he said. "I'll be here when it ends." Armed with nothing but a sidearm and an old pair of binoculars that had belonged to his father. Himself a veteran of Normandy, Eli took position on the high ridge overlooking the valley. From there, the fake convoy shimmered in the heat mirage, looking exactly like a sitting duck. Hours passed, the sun baking the rocks and their patience thin. Then came the dust plume, just as predicted. Enemy vehicles, faster this time, leaner, likely emboldened after retreat, roared into the valley in tight formation. At their center was a communication truck nearly identical to the decoy Eli had scouted in the first encounter. He tracked it through the lens, heart steady, hand not shaking. "Wait," he whispered over the shortwave. "Wait for them to dismount." Timing was everything. Too early, and they'd scatter. Too late, and they'd overrun the site. Then, doors opening, boots dropping, men fanning out. "Now," Eli said. Finch triggered the sequence. Controlled explosions blossomed along the ridgeline first, collapsing the return path. Then the valley itself shook with the roar of detonations, not from above but beneath, charges placed in precise intervals based on Eli's terrain sketches. The enemy convoy twisted and fractured, their formation broken. In the chaos, Ross broadcast an intercepted message from the enemy's own frequency, twisted slightly to sound like a retreat order. Confusion spread. Half of them fled, others stood down, unsure who was giving orders. A few surrendered. The trap had worked. In the aftermath, captured documents and equipment revealed not only plans for future attacks but connections to a network of field officers coordinating supply thefts and sabotage. One of those arrested, disguised in civilian garb, turned out to be a ranking strategist who had eluded coalition forces for over a year. Eli stood at the edge of the valley the next day, watching engineers sift through wreckage, and he said nothing. The others did. Finch called him the old fox. Ross laughed and told him he ought to be promoted to Chief of Shenanigans. But Eli just looked at the land, the dust rising like smoke over memory, and he thought not of the win, but of all the ones that had come before it, and the ones still to come. He limped back to camp slowly, his legs stiff, his lungs raw from the grit, but inside he felt something quiet and full. Not pride, not satisfaction, but completion. That night, a few officers and enlisted men gathered around a fire pit made from discarded shell casings. They roasted canned beans and passed around lukewarm coffee, and Ross nudged Eli to speak. He didn't want to, not at first. He'd never been a speechmaker. But something about the way they looked at him, their eyes open, their respect honest, made him clear his throat. "I wasn't supposed to be out here," he began, voice gravelly but steady. "I was retired. Thought my wars were behind me. Thought I'd pass tools, not orders. But war doesn't care what year you were born in or how many gray hairs you've got. Sometimes, it just needs someone who remembers what others forgot." There was silence after, not from awkwardness, but from weight. Later, Ross handed him a folded paper. On it was a hand-drawn insignia, 2 crossed wrenches under a field map. "Unofficial unit logo," she said. "We're thinking of calling ourselves Mason's Mirage." Eli laughed until he coughed, then pocketed the paper. He didn't need medals. This was enough. A week later, he boarded a chopper out of the valley, the war not yet over, but his part in it winding down. He left behind blueprints, field notes, and a team that now believed not just in protocol, but in possibility. As the bird lifted, blades chopping the heat-heavy air, Eli stared out over the terrain one last time. He thought of his wife, long past, and the promise he'd made to never return to war. He whispered, "I kept most of it, love," and then shut his eyes, letting the wind remind him he was still alive. Back in the States, he would walk slower, drink stronger coffee, and speak even less. But somewhere, in a forward camp in a dusty land, soldiers would still use the Valley Pass, would still reference the decoy convoy, would still repeat the name Mason with something close to reverence. And in time, when this war, too, became another chapter in history books, maybe one of them would tell the story of an old man with a bad leg and a sharp eye who saw what no one else did and proved that courage doesn't come with age. It comes with conviction. If this story of resilience and wisdom inspired you, share your thoughts below. How would you face such a challenge? What lessons from your own life echo Eli Mason's courage? ChatGPT